Hello, good people. In this video, we're going to take a couple of moments to explore a couple of different essential camera techniques that will hopefully help you create more realistic looking render. Sometimes you get the lighting in a good place. The materials are all but finished, but the image really doesn't look quite that realistic yet. And with these basic techniques, we are going to try and help you add that little bit of extra realism to it all. Now, one of the most important aspects when it comes to creating pleasant and realistic looking imagery is getting the exposure right. Now, getting the exposure right is most certainly a creative endeavor, but typically speaking, an underexposed image is less than ideal. An overexposed image is also typically less than ideal, of course, unless that helps you convey a certain emotion or mood. Now, to control the exposure in V-Ray, you got a couple of different options to choose from. So what you want to do here is you want to select your camera, go into its properties, and then just toggle the V-Ray physical camera to on, go under color and exposure here, and then here you're going to be able to see that you have this exposure mode. Currently it's set to no exposure, which means none of the settings in here are going to affect the exposure in your camera, but you can change this to, for example, exposure value. And now you're adjusting the exposure on your camera using this exposure value parameter input field. So lower values mean brighter image, higher values mean a dimmer image. Alternatively, you can also set the exposure mode here to physical exposure, and now you're controlling the exposure in the image using these aperture parameters in here. So the same sort of parameters you would use on a real world camera. So just to demo it, if we up the ISO, the image is going to get brighter. If we lower the F number, for example, the image is going to get brighter. And if we, for example, go with a slower shutter speed, well, then the image is going to get really bright. Another way to control your exposure is through the VFB itself. You can simply add the exposure layer, which should typically be the first in the stack, and then you can mess with the exposure slider in there, and that will work as you would expect it to. It will adjust the exposure in your image. Plus, it also works regardless of the camera exposure mode you're in. So do keep that in mind. Now, needless to say, any of the modes you opt to go with that we showcase here are physically accurate, and where they differ is just in the way that you get to that result of controlling your exposure, just different ways of controlling your exposure. Okay, now another important bit that will help add realism to your images is going to be the way that your images get tone mapped. The example in front of us right now is an example of an image that arguably has nicely set exposure, but as you can see, the highlights, so the brightest parts of the image, are just way too strong. It's almost like they're radiating light, plus things kind of look posterized. And so every rendered image should have some form of tone mapping applied to it so that in the end, it looks more like a photo would look like. Now in V-Ray, you have a couple of different ways to tone map your image. One of them is to just simply bring in the exposure layer and then just lower the highlight burn here to a point where you're kind of happy with it. And as you can see, these highlights look a lot more controlled now. Now, another way to tone map your image is by the use of the filmic tone map layer. So by default, the type here is set to Hable, and this gives you quite a bit of control and a very specific look that's, well, Hable-like. You can switch the type here from Hable to Ampus, for example. This is that ACES tone mapping look, but it really doesn't give you any control. Bottom line, you probably will want to experiment with all these different options depending on the visual style that you're going for. Broadly speaking, the filmic tone map, what it does is it rolls off the highlights and controls the shadows in a way so that the image then a little bit more resembles an image that was created on film or on a film-like camera, broadly speaking. Now, for when it comes to realism, another important thing to consider is the actual lens you are using. Okay, so with this particular camera here, we're using a lens with a focal length of 50 millimeters. And as you can see, the image is sort of balanced in some ways. So the edges aren't too distorted and the sort of depth in the image is not too compressed. We can make out the distance, but that the distance between the bowl and the sofa here is, well, there is some distance between the two. Now, what we could do here is we could go with a focal length of, let's say, 150 millimeters. In this case, we would have to pull the camera backwards quite a little bit, but observe how, we're basically standing in the angle of this, the corner of this room. And observe what happens here is everything is very, very compressed. There is almost no depth in the image, which might be the look that you're going for detailed shots. A lot of the times this is sort of what you want, but a focal length of 150 millimeters is probably not quite as realistic for an interior image such as this one, even for close-ups. So that's something to keep in mind, right? You do want to use a tele lens, maybe 80 millimeters. That might be a little bit more fitting for this use case, or maybe 100 millimeters or something like that. But 150 or 200 would probably be too much, and you probably wouldn't use that kind of a lens in the real world. Alternatively, you probably also wouldn't use a 15 millimeter lens for a close-up image, right? In this case, as you can see, the borders of the image are distorted. The sofa compared to the bowl seems really far away, etc., etc. Now, you could use a lens like this in the real world, but typically for close-ups and for these types of images, you don't. And so that's why this might feel off and not necessarily quite as realistic looking. Now, much like you can in the real world, you can use the different lenses to convey different senses of scale or invoke different emotions in the viewers by, for example, having a 20 millimeter lens close to a rather small toy, which can make it feel bigger than it is. Where this affects the realism in your scenes if you use unrealistic values that wouldn't be quite common in the real world, or they wouldn't be possible in the real world. So visual references of real world photos can be of great help here, as well as you actually owning a camera and trying to snap pictures with it. Now, of course, rules are meant to be broken, so you should experiment with unorthodox lenses and unorthodox positioning, but it's also cool to stay grounded. Okay, now another tip would be to always try and have your depth of field effect turned on. In this image, the depth of field really adds a lot to make things look more realistic and more interesting visually speaking. There's also storytelling aspects to using depth of field as well, but in the context of this tutorial, we'll focus just on the realism bit. So on a real world camera, you can't disable depth of field, and so it is suggested to also try and have it on in the CG world as well. Here's an example of a photo taken in the real world. And notice how even though the furniture is sort of the focus point, you can see that the sofa is more in focus than the chair in front of it. Now, yes, you could opt for a wider lens or a different f-stop value on your camera, but the point is there's always going to be a bit of depth of field that is softening parts of your image. But now, how do you turn it on in V-Ray? Well, it's real simple. Just go into your physical camera settings, go all the way down here to where it says depth of field and motion blur, and then just toggle depth of field to on. And just like that, you're going to have depth of field in your image. Now, you're probably going to want to control the focus distance. You can do that using the focus distance parameter here. You can input the distance manually if that's what you would like, or you can set it to focus on a specific object, right? Alternatively, the quickest way is to just simply right-click on your viewport rendered image and select the depth of field distance pick option, okay? And then you can just pick wherever you want the focus distance to be at. In this case, we picked this part of the leaf here, and now this leaf is in focus. Now, another thing to keep in mind with your depth of field is to try and stick to reasonable f-stop and lens combinations. So if you go with a really silly wide-angle lens and a weirdly low f-stop value, you'll get unrealistic looking images because those types of combinations just aren't common or sometimes even possible in the real world. So having some hands-on camera experience in the real world can be immensely valuable as you operate your virtual camera in your CG world. All right, okay, and there we have it. We are at the end of this tutorial. We hope you've learned something new here. We hope you've enjoyed watching the video. And if you'd like to share your creations, renders that you make, please head over on our forums. We have a gallery section there. Or if you have any questions, comments, criticisms, well, we do read the comments underneath these videos. Thank you so much for tuning in. We will see you in the next one.